My name is Carlos Enrique Maybeth Mortimer, and I'm doing a presentation on a number of subjects pertaining to Nicaragua. The title of my presentation, which is also the title of my senior project, is Indigenous Nicaraguan Encounters with Capitalism and Colonialism to Structural Adjustment. Because I have to do a bridge version of this because my paper is quite long, I'm going to be kind of hopping, skipping around, but I want to first start off with some general subjects that are going to be becoming recurring themes throughout the presentation, but also are recurring themes within my paper. These are indigenous rights, capitalism, structural adjustment, environmental degradation, inequality, and an expansive amount of Nicaraguan history. To start us off, I just want to say my own personal placement within this study and how my academic and personal life relates to what I'm studying. I was born in Nicaragua, and I've been studying Nicaraguan history, culture, and politics extensively for the past 2 years. And in my studies, I began to see a lot of different interconnecting themes over history, politics, culture, and for a long time I didn't really know what was this cohesive framework that had all these subjects I felt were together. And it wasn't until I started working on my senior project that I realized that a lot of it had to do with the economic systems that have been in place since the colonial era. And with further study, but at first I thought that was too broad of a subject matter. I thought it's better to focus on a smaller thing, pick one subject like the forest or this economy or this political figure. But I realized that sometimes to really understand a lot of different challenges and obstacles within any given thing, you kind of have to look at the macroeconomic picture or just the big picture of things. But at first I started off with wanting to investigate the connections between structural adjustment and deforestation. Now, structural adjustment are the policies that are set in place by the IMF and World Bank. They're supposed to be just proposals, but essentially they're mandates to receive loan predications. But I wasn't really satisfied with just the simplistic analysis that I've been reading and studying, and so I decided to incorporate a lot of Nicaraguan history. And then saw larger connections between not only Nicaragua, but our country and the whole world as a whole. One of the most influential, I could just say, academics with my work is a man by the name of Emanuel Wallerstein. And his approach is a world system analysis. So instead of studying something by, is it through this political movement or this political movement or, the culture or class, he just views things as world systems, what is happening in the entire world, and it really gives you a wider perspective. And for his definition, which I agree upon, about when the capitalist world system started was in the early colonial era. And it's basically the endless accumulation of capital. Now there had been, loans, credit, employers, and all kinds of things before that point, but it wasn't until the colonial era that a lot of the world economy became interconnected, and that you could begin to amass large amounts of capital for the purpose of making more capital. And this is something that to keep in mind throughout my whole presentation. Now, to get everyone somewhat familiar with, and sorry about the low resolution of the map, but Nicaragua is in Central America. It is the largest country in Central America. It's roughly the size of Georgia, if any of you all are familiar with how big Georgia is as a comparison. And so it's very economically, politically, it's very strategic because it's right in the middle of the Western Hemisphere. This is a more detailed map. This is eastern Nicaragua, Honduras to the north, Costa Rica to the south. Many of the places and people I'm going to be talking about will take place within the capital, Managua, Leon, and Granada to the south, as well as Puerto Cabezas in the east and Bluefield to the southeast. So this is a further, more detailed map displaying individual departments, or what we would call states in the United States. Now, to begin some history. The best place to talk about this world system analysis is to begin with the colonial era, and to really give you an idea of how everything got started. Is you have to understand somewhat of the geography and ecology of Nicaragua. Eastern Nicaragua is largely subtropical wetlands that flood frequently, as seen in this picture, as well as tropical forests, as seen in this picture. The environment is very different, and that has influenced the culture of the indigenous tribes that inhabited the region prior to European contact. And because of less fertile soil and frequent flooding, a lot of the indigenous people in eastern Nicaragua were migratory and didn't have large settlements. So the population in eastern Nicaragua was much smaller than in western Nicaragua. Western Nicaragua, on the other hand, was much more fertile. Nicaragua is part of the Ring of Fire, if any of you are familiar with that runs all the way around the Pacific Rim. So there's a number of volcanoes, as you can see in the background, giving western Nicaragua extremely fertile soil. And the natural mountains and valleys created like a borderline Eden for the indigenous people lived there. They had much higher populations. Like the estimates, the most accurate estimates based upon my analysis, are 800,000 to 1 million indigenous people lived in eastern Nicaragua alone prior to European contact. Another picture of western Nicaragua, volcanoes, mountains. So it's predominantly valleys and then high, rich soil highlands. Now, many people might be familiar with what happened often with European contact with indigenous people. Disease often wiped off many people, and with conquering colonization, more people died, more people were enslaved. But the history of Nicaragua is unique, where many other Latin American states were only colonized by the Spanish. Nicaragua was colonized simultaneously by the British and the Spanish. And where they colonized, one, the British on the eastern coast, and two, the Spanish on the western coast, influenced how the indigenous people fared. There was higher populations in western Nicaragua, so disease hit them harder. Also, because of the desire to have capital and gold and silver, it was profitable to sell off indigenous slaves to more profitable colonies in Guatemala. So again, the most accurate estimates that I could find were anywhere between 200,000 and 500,000 indigenous people were sold into slavery, which heavily depopulated western Nicaragua, which was already largely depopulated because of the diseases that hit. When the British came, and a couple hundred years later in the 1700s, it was a bit of a different story. They wanted to carve out an enclave for themselves as a buffer zone against the Spanish. And what they did is they partnered with one of the indigenous tribes in the region to help extract materials and kind of act as armed men against the Spanish. And in that case, that often, my own tribe, the Mosquito, they partnered with them. And it relied often on indigenous slaves because before African slaves were brought into the Americas, there were indigenous slaves first, and poor farmers couldn't afford African slaves because it was expensive to ship them all the way from Africa. So my tribe, not that I'm proud of it, but they would sell predominantly the males of rival tribes to the British in exchange for guns, steel, machetes, and other tools like that, which gave them not only an edge against their rival tribes, but also the Spanish. And as time progressed, the tribe began to take on a lot of British cultural norms and things. In this picture, you can see one of the Mosquito Kings, or at that time Prince Clarence, with his council and advisors, the upper echelon of the Mosquito Society began taking on clothing and cultural norms of the British. They weren't forced into it, they voluntarily often changed their names. As you can see evidence with my own name. Half my name is Spanish and the other is Anglo in origin. But again, it was voluntary. It was an admiration of the skills and tools that they saw and the alliance that they had against the Spanish. And so colonization, at least in regards to my own tribe, was not necessarily a negative thing. It was negative for the other tribes and other people, but it wasn't negative for them. It was an opportunity for them to enrich and empower themselves. And they extended their reach. If we look back to this map of eastern Nicaragua, where they were predominantly centered in the rivers and the coastal regions, they went all the way up to Honduras and all the way down to Costa Rica with the increased population, tools, and steel, and the alliance with the British. As time progressed and different economies rose and became more dominant, the Spanish colonies gained independence, the British Empire started to decline, and so did the fortunes of the Mosquito, my own people. But during this whole time, in western Nicaragua, there was severe persecution of the indigenous people. Their lands were often taken, and often when the Spanish would come in, they would say, "We claim all this land." And then if the indigenous people wanted it back, they would have to buy it back. And in many cases in Nicaragua, they purchased their own lands back from the Spanish crown. When independence happened in many Latin American countries, but particularly in Nicaragua, the lands that they bought back, the new Nicaraguan government did not recognize, so they got their lands taken from them again, which just started years and years and years of appropriation and persecution. And again, it was to amass more and more capital and organize things towards the world markets, something that started in the early colonial era and continues to expand. As the British Empire began to wane, what I classify as the American Empire took not only the British Empire's place in a lot of different parts of the world, but also the Spanish Empire. They attained Puerto Rico. If you didn't know why, Puerto Rico is a territory of ours that used to be a Spanish colony, and we took it over. We took over the Philippines, we were in Haiti, and we were definitely in Nicaragua. As I mentioned before, how influential the Americans were in Nicaragua cannot be understated. During the turn of the century, early 19th century, they controlled Nicaraguan finances, they controlled the Nicaraguan military, they controlled Nicaraguan politics. Nothing got done without a go-ahead from the American embassy. There was pushback, though. There was a man by the name of Sandino, who, and this is a picture of U.S. Marines posing, who were in Nicaragua at that time. And the U.S. Marines were stationed in Nicaragua between 1911 and 1933, off and on, continuously, between 5,000 Marines at any given moment to reinforce American control of the country, and its finances and its exports. There was pushback as I mentioned, by Sandino, and there was temporarily, and this is actually U.S. Marines capturing a flag of Sandino. This is a black and white photo, but this is red and black. Red represents socialism or communism, black represents anarchy, and it essentially means socialism by any means. Eventually, being bogged down in a guerrilla war, the Americans did not want anything to do with the conflict anymore. We often think about soldiers bogged down in war with either Vietnam or Iraq, but way before that, things that were hitting the headlines were another Marine dies in Nicaragua, another Marine dies in some backward third world country, and wanting to maintain control of the nation, the Americans began to wanting to Nicaraguanize the conflict. So they utilized a general and someone who'd been educated in the United States to basically oppress their own people. and insert a dictator. And during this period of time, there was a number of different dictators. Before Somoza, there was Zelaya, but again, which becomes an ongoing theme, there became further abuse of indigenous people, particularly in western Nicaragua, and appropriation of more land, to the point where in the early 1900s, the indigenous people no longer had community ownership of their land. And were almost forced into virtual slavery, where they had to have quotas to work on haciendas and large export-oriented farms because they were indigenous. And so the trend did not stop, even as the centuries continued and continued. And this is a picture of Somoza, who his family controlled Nicaragua for almost 60 years. So this is why I put particular emphasis on a picture of him. There's an unconfirmed quote from FDR that, when referring to Somoza, speaking of FDR, that's FDR and Somoza, that, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard, meaning that they knew he was a terrible human being and had multiple human rights abuses, but it was their man in Nicaragua. And during this period, Somoza used, after World War I, during World War II, and leading up to the war years, he used the whole opportunity to amass more and more wealth. And he began not just targeting, indigenous people and lower caste people. For instance, he would target German immigrants, take all their lands, and say it was for the war effort. And the inequality rose and rose and rose. Inequality throughout Latin America is already a huge issue, but it was to the nth degree, where I believe it was 1954, there were 90% of the economy was generated by 2,000 individuals in Nicaragua. Jumping a bit forward, but also getting into the more modern era, and how a lot of these old trends of inequality, capital accumulation, mismanagement, and corruption have not really changed. They just kind of go under new namesakes. Is a good example is kind of the World Bank and IMF. Now, I do not believe that everything the World Bank and IMF do is bad, but there is a clear history of them giving loans to dictators and to oppressive governments without any predications of helping out the poor or anything. As this little blurb I wrote shows, between 1948 and 1956, Nicaragua received at least 9 loans. And both of these institutions knew very well who they were dealing with. And the corruption and the cronyism, it wasn't a secret. It was very well known, yet they still received loans. And these loans basically all went to Somoza, but the Nicaraguan state was left with the tab. And some of it went to investment, but all of it was geared towards export-oriented agriculture, which really just ruined the environment, particularly in western Nicaragua. They chopped down trees, clear cut, and used heavy chemicals and other things that were unhealthy, and there's, like I said, a long history of these two organizations not really having any moral quandaries with giving money to terrible people. And it goes to the larger thing that capitalism is neither good or bad, and there's an assumption that capitalism is inherently good. Making money is good, but it's only good if it helps people and it helps more people. Where the way capitalism works, and again, I'm gonna go back to Wallerstein's one of his definitions, is that there's a misconception that it functions best when there's competition, but this is a misnomer. If you analyze any successful business, it relies on some sort of monopoly. Even if you just look at patent laws, having one company and not that I'm against patents, but having one company only be able to make something for a set number of years is a small monopoly, or a quasi-monopoly, as Wallerstein likes to call it. Everywhere around the world, capitalism functions within monopolies, and unless you have regulations to stop sort of cronyism and corruption, they'll run roughshod. And what happens is that, again, terms, widely used academic terms, and I prefer to use it, instead of dividing the world into first, second, and third world countries, I prefer to divide the world into core countries, semi-periphery countries, and periphery countries. Core countries like the United States, Western Europe, and now Japan and South Korea, they make leading products, and countries from all over the world buy these products at their most expensive rate. Once the profitability runs out and these main monopolies run out, they are moved then to semi-periphery and periphery countries, where these countries make these same products but for cheaper. And so there's a constant flow of net gain to core countries. And one of the large problems with what the IMF and World Bank recommend is they want more liberal things. They want less protectionism, even though many of the most advanced nations, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, they depended upon protectionism to develop. I forgot which economist. There's a famous economist who said that it would be dumb for the Americans to put up protections and invest in industry, that they should focus on agriculture. Can you imagine if the United States had only focused on agriculture and not developed their own industries? Where would we be now? But it is often what we recommend as the United States government, and what these international organizations recommend, is to not go by your comparative advantage, but no country is bequeathed a natural industrial complex. That is something you have to develop, or any other industry or new idea that could be profitable. You have to develop that. There are natural resources that countries have, oil, climate to grow like coffee or bananas like in Nicaragua, but other industries you have to develop. And it's kind of like asking a heavyweight boxer to fight a lightweight with his two hands tied behind his back. It doesn't really make sense. But I somewhat digress. Another reason I particularly am, aside from being from Nicaragua, studying extensively, why I really like Nicaragua and why I piece together this wider analysis, is that it's often hard to have an analysis of something because there's so many different factors that go into anything: politics, economics. It's hard. How can you really analyze it when there's all these different factors? How do you control for these things? And Nicaragua is an interesting case because of a conflict. After the Somoza dynasty was eventually removed by the Sandinistas, who were inspired by Sandino, the freedom fighter from back in the day. And for 10 years, there was a somewhat socialist government in charge, which did land redistribution, healthcare, education, and eventually a lot of the benefits of these kind of wore out as conflict with the United States and a civil war sponsored by the United States drained the resources. But with the elections that happened in the 1990s, you kind of have a reset where all the other nations in Latin America were already under structural adjustment policies, were already kind of under the foot of the Western world. Nicaragua was just getting into that in the 90s. Also, because of the conflict and the nature of it, a guerrilla warfare, many people fled from the interiors of the country. So you get to see less environmental damage. As a comparable example, when Genghis Khan swept all across Asia and Europe, the amount of trees and oxygen that got produced in the world grew because he killed so many people. And unfortunately, it's a similar case where the conflict allowed less damage to the environment and less people were putting strains on natural resources. So in the 90s, you have a time that is a perfect analysis of World Bank and IMF programs. Structural adjustment is based upon neoliberal theory, which is a laissez-faire idea that you just need to, government is often the obstacle of things, and that you need to privatize things, you need to trim down government ownership of things, and make things more competitive. And what that often translates to, and as I've mentioned before with capital accumulation and inequality, is that the people who can take advantage of policy shifting are often the people with a lot of money, a lot of resources, and this tends to be the elites who have always ruled, particularly the Latin American nations. And at the other side of the spectrum, defenders of this theory, particularly when it go in regards to Nicaragua, will say, well, in the 90s when structural adjustment happened, rapid hyperinflation stopped, the economy grew, and then more products and grains and everything excelled. A counter to that, though, is that part of before the Sandinista government wasn't receiving loans, wasn't receiving aid, and the grain increases have more to do with migration. And this, again, sorry about hopping around everyone, but this led me to the environmental aspect of this my paper, and how structural adjustment and these theories and capitalism as a whole can affect the environment. Because of the extreme poverty that was brought on by these policies, people began migrating. Now, normally people assume that people will migrate to cities, and that did happen. They migrated to the major cities in Nicaragua and to the major cities of Costa Rica. But because there was a perception of lots of available land in eastern Nicaragua, thousands of people began migrating to eastern Nicaragua. Mostly mestizo campesinos, and mestizos are people of mixed, predominantly indigenous and Spanish descent, and they were moving to a predominantly indigenous and Afro-Caribbean region, and their cultural practices of agriculture, which they've been reinforced with clear cutting, coffee, cows, grains, it is very damaging to eastern Nicaragua, because if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, scroll way back, if you compare wetlands and jungle compared to highlands and valleys, there's vast differences in soil quality, where rich fertile soil can sustain, it's not good to clear cut it, but it's less detrimental, where with wetlands and tropical forests, all of the nutrients are in the trees, in the animals, in the plants. If you compare it to in the north, like in Maine where we are, a lot of the carbon and a lot of just matter is stored deep within the ground. So although it's bad to cut down trees, it's not as detrimental if you cut down trees in the rainforest, because if you cut down trees in the rainforest, there's much more carbon released into the atmosphere, and that contributes to global warming. It's part of the reason why there is such an emphasis on protecting tropical rainforests. Not that all forests are important and should be preserved, but tropical rainforests are very sensitive, and growing them back is exceedingly difficult. And so these migratory patterns are putting more pressure on these environments that can't really sustain them. And the cultural practices of clear cutting and plotting out, having cows, are different from indigenous practices, which have nucleated communities that have much less impact. Also, they don't clear cut. They have a plot, they use it for a year, and then they let it grow back, and then they move on to another plot and come back. But again, with accumulation and the mentality of getting more money, more capital, and they become bigger, it's how can I make money right now, coming from settlers coming from the east. And to draw kind of a comparison towards our history within the United States, in the United States, we have this concept of the Wild Wild West. In Nicaragua, it's the Wild Wild East. So if you think of our westward expansion, the displacement of indigenous people, it's similar, but it's in the other direction. And there's a bit more at stake because of the natural environment that is so sensitive. There's a wildlife reserve called the Basuas, which is one of the lungs of the world. It's like the Amazon, but significantly smaller. But it's one of the remaining tropical lungs of the world, and it is being cut down at a rate that people estimate by 2035 it will be gone. And that's really bad. Illegally, but also legally. I have skipped around a bit, and I'm not sure how I am on time.
You're at 32 minutes.
I'm past the time, so there should be question and answers. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, so if there's any questions or more clarification on topics, there's so much going through my head right now, then there's a lot that I can expand upon, and I'm not really sure if I did a good job of clarifying all the connections and how they are so connected to each other, and how assuming that the status quo is good or inherently good is not good, is bad, and that things need to seriously change in the way we think about the world and our economies, and that it's not just everything in Nicaragua is interconnected, but everything in this world is interconnected through the capitalist world system. So that is my presentation on my senior study. Any questions?
I'm getting the feeling that the impact on the poor and the economy, you're talking about that whole concept of trickle down economics isn't getting down to the majority of the people.
No, that's actually a really good question. It isn't at all, and it's essentially often what these international organizations promote is trickle down theory, but on a global scale. And trickle down theory never works in a meaningful way. It might help a few people out, but overall most of the wealth is centered in the wealthiest people, and decisions by those people are not made to benefit the greater populace. It's made to benefit themselves and to make more capital, which is the end goal of capitalism, essentially.
Is the World Bank more of a political organization than what it was originally designed to, in these days, than it was originally designed to be, the World Bank, in your opinion?
Yes and no. Yes, in that the World Bank and the IMF's original conception, so to speak, was to rebuild war-torn Europe. But even when they were designed at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, close to us, there were already plans to put political agendas in it. Initially, the Soviet Union was part of the Bretton Woods thing, but when the world economy was based upon the U.S. dollar, and when all the finances would be in the hands of predominantly American bankers and politicians and Western European bankers and politicians, it became clear that there was political orientation behind it. But its initial, was good. They gave out tons of money to war-torn Germany, France, United Kingdom. It really helped those nations get off their feet, invest money in industries, fix their buildings, fix their infrastructure, and Japan as well. But afterwards, especially with the Cold War, it has been used as a tool to promote certain agendas. And again, important thing I forgot to mention about the Bretton Woods thing and about there being always being a political underpinning to it is that voting in the World Bank is done, part of it is done by fair representation, but more often than not, it's based upon essentially, I could get into the complicated nitty-gritty of it, but basically it boils down to how much money you contribute to the UN, not the UN, the World Bank. And so, since the US after World War II was in the best economic situation of any country we had basically veto power. We had 17% contribution, and we locked that in. We're currently at 15, and that hasn't changed, even though our share of the world economy is completely, it's different. It's a multipolar world. It's not a bipolar with Soviet Union and the US. It's multipolar now, but that there hasn't been changes or reform to represent that. And so often US interests are placed above the interests of everyone else. And to his credit, Obama tried to have reform and go along with the reforms that have been in place since proposed since 2010. But because, again, these systems have been locked in place, the Republican Congress has refused to ratify these changes, which has made competing infrastructure banks like the Asia Infrastructure Bank by China or BRIC banks, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, competing institutions. But again, it comes back to where is the emphasis with this capital? What is it doing? What is the point of it?
Do the people receiving the capital have an effect on the policies of the World Bank and IMF?
More often than not, which is another...
They do or they don't?
They don't.
They don't.
Again, it's talked as policy recommendations, but if you don't follow them, you don't get the money. And their room to negotiate is minimal at best. So basically they have to just accept what these institutions tell them. And you know, economists have varying ideas of how about do things, but with the World Bank and IMF, they often hire people who have similar ideologies of them. And that's not a bad thing, but you need a balance of ideas to really, you know, stay dynamic and change, you know, things they talk about capitalism, but they really, a lot of the things that they espouse, they don't necessarily follow themselves, and they don't really have a conscious understanding that capitalism is based upon having monopolies at certain stages and then moving them to different countries depending on how profitable they are. Or they do have an understanding of it and they just want to keep the status quo, but I like to give the benefit of the doubt that they, you know, when they're like, oh, it's the system didn't work because of corruption or this or that or cronyism, it's like, that's how the system works. It's successful, it's making money. Is it benefiting people? It might not necessarily, and I've read the reports where they're like, well, the economy grew in the country, but people are still very poor. And they're like, almost like, oh, why? It's, well, if it's in a small, if all the money is in a small number of hands, it's not going to benefit people. It doesn't matter if the wealthy person is 10 times richer. How's that going to benefit the masses? And I don't know, there needs to be serious reform and just, I guess you say, a paradigm shift in the way we think about not just each individual nation, but the entire world. And that's one thing that I like that Wallerstein emphasized, the academic I keep on mentioning, is that you can't just focus on one thing, because one country, one economy, it can't control everything like in the past, where at certain times in history, at the peak of the British Empire, at the peak of American Empire, right after World War II, there was so much power concentrated in one, but that's not the reality of the world anymore. And it wasn't necessarily a good thing when it was. And we have to think globally now. It's the reality of it, and we have to think of how we can help more people. And especially going back to the environmental aspects of the presentation in my paper, it's critical that we address these issues, or our ability to live on this planet was seriously in question if we continue to act the way we are. I'm very hopeful that, you know, even though new technology relies upon, you know, environmentally damaging things like this computer right here, I'm hopeful that new generations are very conscious of this, but I feel that it just has to move faster, essentially.
Coming off of the World Bank and the effects of that, are there large environmental groups that are having an effect through the rainforest preservation, and how does that affect the poor people and indigenous peoples? Is that a different mindset that's modern?
There can be, that's another good question, something I kind of overlooked as well. There can be conflicts between organizations that are wanting to do good, like particularly German and Swedish environmental groups, where they want to set up environmental reserves and just let it be natural, but they don't take into account the critical importance of the indigenous people in maintaining and protecting that. And so sometimes, particularly after the war, indigenous people would come back to where they were with their lands, and it was now a wildlife refuge. And
So
not
they had to flee because of the war, and then
coming back, they had to come in conflict with conservationists who didn't necessarily want them there.
claimed it while they were gone.
Exactly. And that it isn't until recently that there have been advanced comparisons between how indigenous people operate in forests and natural environments and how settlers with a more of a European mindset of developing land impact things. They've had satellite imagery over I think 2 decades comparing the impact of indigenous communities and settlers. And the indigenous communities, their impact on the rainforest is almost negligible because they cut back stuff, but then they let it all grow back. Where settlers, not even just for kindling, they consider the forest an obstacle, so they'll just burn down and clear cut, not allowing anything to grow back. And often this creates ethnic problems where sometimes the settlers think indigenous people are lazy. It's like they don't cut down trees, they're lazy. Where they rely upon large swaths of forest to feed themselves. They don't have a lot of cows, instead they hunt in the forest. With less and less forest, it becomes harder and harder for them to practice traditional means of sustaining themselves. And it's, so.
Means that are sustainable on a large enough environment.
And require large territories. It's a lot of times it's the emphasis why does this indigenous group with only 10,000 members, why does it need a quarter of the country?
Yeah.
There isn't it's a wasted land, but there isn't a mindset there of why it's important to preserve those vast tracts of land. And but at the same time, you can't wholly blame those settlers coming in because they were pushed off their lands in Western Nicaragua because of structural adjustment policies, because of the appropriation of land. And so again, it's one of these things that are all interconnected.
So what does the future hold for Nicaragua?
I'm hopeful, but I think the largest thing at stake now is the canal that the Chinese are building. I'm hoping that the environment will defeat them. Because at first there was ideas of making a high-speed rail system to connect both coasts and having really modern ports lift freight and other things, but they wanted to do a wet canal. I'm hoping that they'll realize that the difficulty of doing what they're doing and switch to what they call a dry canal, which is that modern rail system, 2 ports, that will be less detrimental to the natural environment. Because there's already massive migration to eastern Nicaragua because of the perception of making, free land and territory and, growing stuff. But with the jobs that will come with a canal, to draw emphasis, I can't believe I forgot this comparison. It's like if one single work project in the United States would hire 1.5 million people. What senator, what politician would turn that down? 1.5 million jobs. And if they could grow the US economy by 7, who would turn that down, no matter what environmental risk there was? There's some politicians who would, but realistically speaking,
Major fight.
it'd be a huge fight. And both parties would be hard pressed to refuse that much money, that much, job growth, that much everything. And it kind of ties back to the value system of just endless capital and no reason for it, just capital, and more and more and more. I feel that the next stage of things is to decide, is capitalism working as it is, or do we need to change systems, Or do we need to finally declare that there needs to be an emphasis with this capital, not just make more? Like, what is the point of it? You know.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
And
Great
thank you
job.
for your patience, and sorry for hopping around. Thank you for the cameraman, Truman Forbes, and his professionalism. And I will be doing more refined presentations in the future, hopefully at the museum in Bar Harbor, and also hopefully at the University of Maine, Orono. And if you want to see more details and more refined, come to those presentations, or I can email you my full senior project. I will leave my email here at the front table here. And yeah, thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.